Thank you all for joining us at the first webinar of the Maryland Campaign for Environmental Human Rights of this coming 2022-23 legislative year. As I think most of you know, the MDEHR will not be putting forward a bill for the Environmental Human Rights Amendment this year, but that does not mean that we're going to be quiet. What we want to do is make sure that we have the fullness of the support that we will need building up this through an educational year with the public and with our legislators so that we can come into 2024 with a very good chance of having this amendment passed. So we're working to expand our outreach to the faith community, the youth community, public health, mental health, farming, business, advocacy, water communities, gardening, biking, parenting, grandparenting, whatever community we are able to connect with, which is where you all come in, because if you are part of any of these communities and you can help us connect with them, we would love to be able to work with you to make sure that we get the message out there and we can help people understand that everyone has, as a birthright, a fundamental right to a healthful environment, and that what we need to do is translate that moral right into a legal right, and that's what we're all about. If you're interested in learning more, we are having an ambassador training program Sunday, October 2nd in the afternoon. I see several of you who are signed up for that here today, which is really great. We'd love to have ambassadors be trained in the foundation of environmental human rights and then help us get the word out, represent us on various coalition tables and various regular meetings, and connect us to their community so that we can share the word and make sure that we, as I say, we are poised for the 2024 session to get this bill passed. I am thrilled that we're opening up this season's webinar series with the speakers that we have today. John Knox was appointed the first UN independent expert and then upgraded to Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment. He served at the UN in that capacity from 2012 to 2018. John, if I'm not mistaken, I think that's a volunteer position, isn't that?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, that's just remarkable. How much time do you have to give to that volunteer position?
I mean, honestly, it was pretty much my full-time job, but I also had another full-time job, which involved teaching at Wake Forest in North Carolina, so for a while I kind of had two jobs, but one of them paid the bills and the other took up, the UN job really did take up more of my time, I would say.
Well, thank you for being that inaugural person. We know there's David Boyd is your successor. Both of you have been doing amazing work. You are, as you were just saying, the Henry Lauerman Professor of International Law at Wake Forest University in North Carolina. But in 2018, when you concluded your mandate, you presented the framework principles on human rights and the environment to the United Nations and called upon the UN General Assembly to recognize the human right to a healthy and sustainable environment, which they did with your enormous help this summer. And in case any of you don't know, it was passed, this resolution was passed with 161 votes in favor. They adopted this historic resolution on Thursday, July 28th, declaring access to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment a universal human right. And we're hoping that that would provide, the wind in our sails so that we can take that and say, wonderful, now it's up to nations and states to implement that right with rigorous laws and potentially constitutional provisions. So, John, we're looking forward to hearing more from you. And I am thrilled that we have Delegate Vaughn Stewart from District 19, Montgomery County, with us today to be the interlocutor with John. If any of you have seen Delegate Stewart in hearings, spoken with him, you know how sharp he is, and he gets right to the core of things, and we will have a wonderful conversation between the two of them. Delegate Stewart serves on the Environment and Transportation Committee, which of course is the committee that hears at this moment, for the past few years at least, the Environmental Human Rights Amendment. He's on the Environment Subcommittee, of the E&T committee and on the land use and ethics subcommittee of the E&T committee. He was in 2020 the primary sponsor of the Environmental Human Rights Amendment, and for that we are eternally grateful. And Delegate Stewart, you've just been a champion of ours ever since. He was, just two quick notes about some background. He was an intern at the White House Domestic Policy Council in 2013, and policy director for Jamie Raskin for Congress in 2015, which I actually didn't know. So that's really pretty exciting. And we are thrilled to have you with us. So with that, I would like to turn this over to you, Delegate Stewart.
Well, thank you very much, Nina. I really appreciate the opportunity to facilitate this conversation with Professor Knox this afternoon, and also just to see so many familiar faces. I appreciate the kind words. Just on a personal level, it's been such a pleasure working with you, Nina, and with this entire growing, budding coalition. I know that we've been sort of, to the mountaintop, or, we've been laboring and fighting in the trenches already, whatever metaphor you want to use. We still got a lot of battles left ahead, but I do, I'm as optimistic as ever that we'll eventually get over the finish line here in Maryland. But to that end, I'm so excited to chat this afternoon with Professor Knox, who is such an international figure on this topic and such an inspiration, certainly to me, and I'm sure to all of us. So just to jump right into it, Professor Knox, can I call you John?
Yes,
okay,
please,
all right.
of course.
I think that's probably just, just to make my life slightly easier. So just to go back to this historic UN resolution, just to provide a little background to everyone, what exactly does it say, and what exactly does it mean?
So like other United Nations General Assembly resolutions, there are a lot of preambular paragraphs which provide context, but otherwise I'm not going to get into. The main operative paragraph is the first paragraph, which says simply the General Assembly recognizes the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment as a human right. And then there are additional paragraphs that say that the right is related to other rights and existing existing international law. In other words, it kind of ties it into the human rights world more generally. And interestingly, it says that the promotion of the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment requires the full implementation of multilateral environmental agreements. So that means, as part of achieving this right at the international level, states should be implementing their commitments in international treaties. And then finally, it calls upon states, as well as international organizations, business enterprises, other relevant stakeholders, essentially to implement the right, to adopt policies, enhance cooperation, strengthen capacity building, and so forth. But that's it. It's very general, like all United Nations statements of human rights. It really doesn't get into the nitty-gritty of how exactly to do the implementation. Instead, it just declares that this thing is a right. I also want to make clear just what the legal status is of a General Assembly resolution. It's not like it's legally binding. No one thinks that General Assembly resolutions are legally binding. This isn't an international treaty or something like that. And in fact, many of the states that voted for it, including the United States, made explanations of their vote in which they said, just so we're all clear, we're not intending to change international law here. Nevertheless, this is kind of how international human rights law has historically developed. First comes the declaration in the form of a resolution by the General Assembly, and then that becomes both a standard for states to try and live up to domestically, but also often it does become, let's say, the rough draft of what later becomes a binding treaty.
Right. And you obviously you mentioned sort of the historical arc of how a lot of these resolutions are taken henceforth. Could you talk a little bit about sort of what the background is of the of this resolution in particular? How long has it been in the making? What were the first steps to sort of put it on the table?
Sure. I mean, in some ways, it's been in the works for 50 years. I say that not to discourage you, but just to show that there are really deep roots in the international, and for that matter, the domestic recognition of the right to a healthy environment. I say 50 years because 50 years ago in 1972, that was the first International Environmental Conference in Stockholm, known as the Stockholm Conference. And at that conference, there essentially was already the connection between human rights and the environment made in what was called the Stockholm Declaration. But it really didn't go anywhere after that, not at the international level. Instead, what happened is domestically, many nations around the world, as I imagine you all already know quite well, did adopt the right. The number is now up to 100 or more that have it specifically in their constitution. And of course, in that early period of the 70s, the United States, in some ways, led the way, not at the national level, of course, but at the state level. This is the period in which states like Pennsylvania and Illinois and Montana all added it to their constitution. But in other countries, that continued throughout the 80s and 90s, not so much in the United States, unfortunately. And at the same time, the United Nations really didn't do much with this again until, as Nina said, I was appointed in 2012 and asked by the United Nations essentially to clarify this relationship between human rights and the environment. And it had really developed a lot in many dimensions, over the previous 30 or 40 years. And so I issued a series of reports to the United Nations. And as you heard in the last report, I said, the time has really come for the United Nations to revisit this and finally recognize the right to a healthy environment. My successor, David Boyd, a Canadian law professor, really took up the cause, and he had been fighting for the cause before he was appointed in 2018, and really deserves a lot of credit for making sure that it stayed on the front burner, even through the pandemic period. So in October of last year, the United Nations Human Rights Council, which is the main United Nations subsidiary body on human rights, it finally recognized the right. And then that paved the way for the General Assembly to do so this summer. As you heard, it was adopted by a really overwhelming vote of 161-0, which included the support of a lot of countries that in the past had been, let's say, cautious or even opposed to recognition of the right, including the United States. So in some ways, that's a hopeful sign that I think the zeitgeist is changing, so to speak, even in countries that have traditionally not been as open to it. They are increasingly open to it, at least as reflected in their votes at the United Nations.
Sure, and let's talk about that a little bit more. So this resolution obviously was proposed just last year, and the United States was opposed, and then it was brought back this summer. They were in favor. So we're not talking about a change of position over the course of years or decades. We're talking about within 12 months or so. What would you attribute that sort of change of position to in terms of the United States support and opposition?
Yeah, just to underline what you said, the United States had long been opposed to recognition of this at the international level. When I was, my first job as an attorney was to work for the U.S. Department of State, and I worked on human rights issues. This was in the early 1990s, and I remember reading, having the file on human rights and the environment, so to speak. And the file, I've always joked, but it was really true. It was very short because it only really needed one page, and the page was just, we don't recognize this right. And so that was kind of the U.S. position for a very long time. I think a couple of things changed. One is that over time, and this was a years-long process, the United States became more comfortable with the idea that human rights really did have something to say about the environment. For example, when I was the Special Rapporteur, the United States, while it was not, I would say, enthusiastically supportive of all connections, it did recognize that, for example, environmental defenders, people who try and defend the environment, often at great risk to themselves, they deserve human rights protection. The United States strongly supported that. So there were aspects of the relationship that the United States was comfortable with. And so that gradually increased over time. But what really changed, I think, in the last year was that the Biden administration was kind of brought face to face with the fact that its position internationally was inconsistent with what its own leaders, including President Biden, were saying politically at home. In other words, people like Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, and John Kerry were all using rights language in the environmental context. Joe Biden was saying everyone has the right to clean water and clean air. John Kerry was saying the right to a stable climate is something that people fight and die for around the world. We have to support them. And so the advocacy that was taking place with respect to the United States in particular, a lot of it, I think, was based on the idea that you need to kind of put your money where your mouth is, so to speak. It's simply indefensible for the United States to vote against or even abstain from a statement at the United Nations that you're saying domestically all the time, politically. There's just no justification for that. And I think that helped. I mean, I was pretty involved with discussions with the United States all along. And I think it's hard to change a long-standing position. And so it took them a while to change it. But I do think what really helped is simply the atmosphere politically had changed. And so bringing that home to them helped them kind of bring their position internationally in line with their position domestically.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, I think that there are a lot of parallels here in Maryland. We have also, hopefully, fingers crossed, an impending sort of changing of the guard. We certainly, our governor is, here term limited. We'll get a new governor for sure. We hope, at least I hope, that the governor is a member of my political party and not the past governor's political party. And, I think that this example in terms of the about face, from the Biden administration, or sort of the about face broadly from as it relates to United States policy towards this issue, offers a little bit of hope given the parallel here. And I also think, it's interesting, Nina mentioned in the chat how all of these battles for rights can take place over, decades, this one included. And I think, if you just Google, the UN Declaration of Human Rights and look at other human rights that the United Nations has recognized, each one of them, I mean, from rights for women, rights for racial minorities, freedom to travel. I mean, a lot of these issues have not only taken decades to become even partially actualized, but in some cases, centuries. I mean, in some of these cases, we're talking about the arc of human history trying to recognize these rights. And so I do think this offers a bit of hope, actually, that, it's taken us a few years here to pass this bill, but I think, given the whole arc of this, we kind of all have to be prepared for a long haul battle. So to your point that you made earlier about, this is a non-binding resolution, it makes explicit reference to how the hope is that other, either states in terms of nation states, or I guess subnational entities will sort of take up the baton and actually make it a reality. What would you like to see, the United States do as a country to implement the resolution here, both here and also as it relates to its international posture?
Sure. Well, in a dream world, I would like the United States to amend the Bill of Rights, but I don't really think that's. I'm going to confine myself to the world we live in, at least for the moment. The United States Congress has seen several bills introduced over the last several years, including from people like Senator Booker and Senator Klobuchar, that would essentially kind of codify a more environmental justice / environmental rights approach to environmental protection. And I think we're not that far away from having those bills become law. The United States, in many ways, does have strong environmental laws. It's not like we don't have any at all. But I think in particular, it has become clear over the last 20 or 30 years, really, that we particularly fall short in the ways in which our laws protect marginalized communities that are minorities, racial minorities, or economically worse off, underserved communities of all types, but especially racial minorities in this country, almost always are worse off environmentally. I mean, that's one of the characteristics of being a marginalized community in this country and many other countries around the world, is that you get the short end of the stick on environmental issues. That means you have more polluting sites located near you. It means your often enforcement is less in your areas. And we have just done a miserable job as a country of dealing with that issue. We've recognized it now in many ways for over 2 decades, and yet we really still haven't come to grips with it. And so one thing I personally think, reconceptualizing environmental protection as a matter of human rights or constitutional rights would help to provide impetus for those kinds of changes, for more attention to the way in which our environmental laws, even if they're working in a sense at a very broad macro level, they're not working at an individual level. They're not working at a community level for many, many people in this country. And so certainly the environmental justice movement has been going on for a long time without having the UN General Assembly resolution. I'm not in any way suggesting that this resolution is somehow necessary for that, but I would hope that this kind of recognition helps to support what the environmental justice movement in the United States is already doing, and that politicians and at the state level as well as the national level in the United States would respond to that and continue to enact stronger policies recognizing those rights, and in particular, again, addressing environmental discrimination and what's called environmental racism in our country.
Yeah, absolutely. And John, a few people may already know this on the call, but that's sort of, the issue of environmental racism is really kind of what brings me to the issue and makes me feel so passionate about it, not because I'm a racial minority. In fact, I'm, probably one of the whitest people in the Maryland General Assembly, but I am a 2-time cancer survivor, in all likelihood because Monsanto used my hometown in Alabama as a dumping ground for toxins called PCBs. And it's one of the sort of biggest, pollution crises and scandals in American history. It's a huge Superfund site. My hometown is majority Black, and they targeted the sort of poorest, the least affluent, and the most, Black neighborhood basically in my hometown. It just so happens it turns out when you dump PCBs in the air and the water, it spreads throughout the town, which, while I can't prove a causal link, is probably somewhat related to me, having cancer twice. But so certainly I come to this, to these issues with that lens. And I think that this coalition has been much more sort of intentional in the last couple of years of making sure that this cause is sort of inextricably linked to the cause of environmental justice and the cause of ending environmental racism. That's been something that I think we've been really purposeful about. And I think as a state legislature, I think Maryland has moved very rapidly in the direction of trying to remedy racial injustice. And so to the extent that we can be tied up in that, I think not only is a moral good, but I think it's also from a legislative strategy perspective, the right path to take. So yeah, that all makes sense. So I guess, and this, you've touched on this a little bit, but I guess my next question would be, given that the resolution is not binding and obviously doesn't commit anyone, as you said, people are explaining their votes saying, we don't think this, we're voting for this, but we don't necessarily think this should be international law. I guess my question would be, what hope, what is your hope of the impact that it would have? Given the fact that it's not binding, how do you hope, policymakers, either at sort of a national or subnational level, view it and then run with it?
Well, so again, I think the benefit of these kinds of recognitions in a non-binding way is that they lead to actions that do have binding effect. In other words, they can have a catalytic function. And so for states, and by states, I'm including obviously nation states that belong to the United Nations that voted for this. Again, David Boyd has kind of made a point of contacting a number of them already to say, you voted for this, but you don't actually have this in your constitution. Let's work on that, shall we? And it helps, let's say, make more of a priority in those states, and also hopefully at the United Nations in terms of its many, many offices that help with technical support and advice. It helps to raise the awareness of that and then lead hopefully to some positive changes. For other states, they may already have it in their constitution, or they may have laws that they say do the equivalent. But again, hopefully it can raise more attention to whether those laws are actually doing what they are supposed to be doing. Because obviously there's often an enormous gap between the protections on the books and how it's actually experienced by people. And then, finally, I think there is benefit, symbolic benefit. I think sometimes that's kind of discounted, especially for us lawyers. We're like, well, if it's not legally binding, what good is it really? But it matters to call something a right. It matters to call something a right and know that many, many other people around the world agree with you that it should be a right. That demands further action. It becomes more than just an empty symbol. It becomes a standard of achievement that people are motivated to and argue to others should be They're motivated to try and achieve it themselves or work with others to make sure that it's achieved. I mean, again, to go back to how the United States kind of moved as far as it did, a lot of it was because people began to use rights language just in their policy statements and political speeches. Again, non-binding statements, but they change how people conceptualize the issue. And by changing how you conceptualize the issue, you do then lead to further positive, lasting change, I think.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting point, this kind of like urge of policymakers and politicians at every level to sort of avoid blatant hypocrisy. And I think the sort of takeaway for us, we're still very much in the throes here of an election for ourselves, where we have a lot of important offices on the ballot. We have several statewide elections that have open seats for the first time in decades. And I think, one takeaway from me, John, from what you're saying is, it's really important to get folks on the record about what they believe on some of these issues, because, even though people like to say, politicians will go back on their promises and what have you, even if it's not an explicit promise, even if they're just sort of speaking this language, they're going to be reticent to look silly when, this issue comes up in the future after they've been using that kind of language and not back a bill that essentially just codifies the way they've been talking for years, including to voters when they, had something to gain.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think that's really important. And again, at the international level, that's why states, diplomats at the United Nations, they actually negotiate this language really carefully, even though it's not legally binding, because they know it has this kind of effect in the longer term. And so it's significant that so many states voted for this. They don't do this lightly. This is not like, I don't know, declaring something to be like, the annual day to recognize the, monarch butterfly or something that really has no effect. I don't mean to pick on the monarch butterfly. That would be a good thing to recognize. But, the idea that declaring something to be a human right, it is understood to imply that therefore we should take some steps to try and make sure that people are actually able to enjoy it.
Yeah. And I think it, works both ways. I mean, the fact that I think the resolution passed certainly gives policymakers like me an extra tool in the toolbox to say, hey, this happened, momentum is growing, but also it gives us an answer to, I think, a criticism that could have been, or probably, had previously been leveled in probably a lot of places. And I think I may even heard that here, which is like, well, hey, this isn't even recognized internationally. And so like if the crazy leftist, tree huggers at the UN, this is the perception, obviously, among some people, in Maryland and throughout the country, if they haven't even recognized this, then who are we to make this step? In other words, I think there's kind of like a chronology, as you've said, that's kind of implicit in everyone's mind of who recognizes things first, who is sort of the first mover, and then who are the later adopters. And I think sadly, in this area and a number of others, Maryland has been a late adopter. And so we have to have these validators, these sort of people everyone expects to be early movers, go first. New York State, being an example, before Maryland legislators are willing to sort of take a serious look at this. So I think that's important in that context as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it also gives you a track record to look at. You can see at these other jurisdictions that have adopted it, you can see what happened there and whether it really did result in more positive change or no change or negative change. I mean, there's actually a long history now, especially in some places, including states in the United States. So, this kind of adds to that general, I want to say near consensus. It's also kind of telling the states that did not vote for this. No states voted against it, but the states that abstained include Russia, China, Iran. I mean, the states you think of as kind of being models of the rule of law or of respecting human rights all voted for this, including some of the United States' closest allies, or I would say all of the United States' closest allies. So I'm not saying that's dispositive in itself. None of this is dispositive in itself, but it does help to further the argument.
Yeah, I love that. I love that talking about it. I'm not sure that I'm going to be bold enough to actually say that in a hearing, but I love the fact that our legislative opponents in Maryland are on the side of the Russians.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's interesting. Well, I guess that leads to my next question, which is, what opportunities, but also what challenges do you sort of foresee at doing something like this at a state level, which is obviously what we're committed to doing versus trying to pursue a federal. I mean, obviously you mentioned the big challenge federally is that, it's really tough to change the Bill of Rights, change the Constitution at all. It's tough to pass federal legislation at all, right? Especially with such an evenly divided Congress, even with a Democratic trifecta. We've been living with that reality for the last couple of years. So what sort of, opportunities, but also challenges do you see pushing this as we're doing on a state level versus trying to focus our efforts on the federal level?
Well, obviously, everyone on this call knows more about the situation in Maryland than I do. So I'm not in a position to even try to give you any advice on the Maryland context in particular. I would just say, I guess, that the advantage you have in focusing on this recognition at the state level is that you can focus in particular on cases and situations within the boundaries of your own state that resonate with the people you're talking to. In other words, you don't have to focus so much on, I don't know, climate change or ozone depletion or international issues. You can, of course, if you want to, but again, a lot of the issue that I find resonates with people at the local level is this issue of essentially environmental discrimination, environmental injustice as it's experienced in local communities. People may or may not kind of resonate with the idea that there are international disparities, but it's hard for them not to pay close attention to the problems that affect them directly or affect their neighbors directly. And so that's a huge advantage you have when you're addressing this at a state or even a local level, is that you can talk about specific cases. My successor, David Boyd, the current Special Rapporteur, in his most recent report to the United Nations, his reports on what he calls sacrifice zones. These are areas that are so environmentally polluted or so disadvantaged in environmental matters that it's essentially like they're being treated like sacrifice zones for the rest of us. And David identifies these all over the world. I mean, they're actually a really common feature of the world, unfortunately, when you start looking for them. And so one thing I would suggest focusing on, to the extent you're not already, is where are these sacrifice zones in Maryland? Where are these situations in Maryland that have been left behind and that continually are left behind, even in measures of environmental progress generally? So that when, the Maryland state environmental agencies or whoever are pointing to progress on environmental issues with water pollution or air pollution or whatever, that may well be true on a statewide level. But who's being left out of that? Who's being left behind? And again, having that be the focus of what this kind of change would address, I think should carry political weight.
Yeah, I think that's really wise and really powerful. And I think probably none of us would have any trouble coming up with a few examples, local examples from, we have a trash incineration facility in Baltimore City that's been causing, asthma problems, we know, for, low-income Baltimore children, that we're just sort of letting happen. And not only do we let it happen, not only are we not shutting it down, we're actually subsidizing it through our RPS program. We're calling it renewable energy. And then a number of other subsidies we've given to on the Eastern Shore, which is one of the hotbed of big chicken, of sort of industrial agriculture, which has had some harmful effects on both the water and in the air over there. But I think that's really, I think that's really smart. And I guess I'll pivot into my last question, and then maybe we can take some questions from the chat. This question is in a lot of ways a selfish one, and the one most important to me because it's most relevant to sort of my role here. But I was curious what your responses would be to some of the concerns that we've heard expressed from sort of opposition, committee leadership figures to the bill that we've been doing. And I think both the two that I think we hear most common are not at all specific to Maryland. And I could imagine them probably being posited, at a national or international or, in the context of a different country or a different state. And just want to hear, get your take on sort of what you think the best response is and whether you've heard these brought up, within the context of the UN. The first is that essentially the legislature, by passing a right like this or an amendment like this, would be conferring or delegating too much power over to the judiciary, which is, at least here in a lot of cases, an unelected body. You have these appointed judges who would basically be, empowered to be, judicial superheroes who would all of a sudden with only vague language to guide them. Of course, this echoes some of the debates we've had, lately over the Supreme Court and kind of its recent, what I would, describe as, radicalism. But to what extent are legislators, basically by allowing this kind of amendment to be put up for referendum, are we abrogating our role in this, rather than allowing ourselves, elected members, who of course we all think we're great, rather than us deciding these issues, whether we want to shut down this incinerator or build these solar panels or what have you, why should we hand that off to unelected judges? And then secondly, are we opening up the floodgates to litigation? Relatedly, are we sort of empowering fringe future litigants to bring lawsuits based on a new development that goes up near their house that blocks the sunlight, and now they're going to argue that that's an infringement. And even if they lose, and I think it's likely they would all lose, does that drive up the cost of litigation for the state in a way that is costly and doesn't provide benefits that exceed those costs? So yeah, those are my two things. If you have any thoughts, one would be judicial power, and one would be opening the floodgates.
Sure. So yes, you're absolutely right. Of course, you do see arguments like that in other places as well. And I think there it's useful to kind of respond by saying what's actually happened in other states in the United States. I mean, to keep it focused in the United States, it's just not the case that there's been this kind of explosion of litigation anywhere. Again, the United States at the national and the state level has an extremely well-developed environmental law regulatory system. So it's not as if there's kind of room for courts to come in and remake the whole thing, or a desire, I think, even on the behalf of advocates, to come in and remake the whole thing. A rights-based approach doesn't substitute for environmental regulation. And environmental regulation, again, is already in place. So the question is, what does it do? I think, again, it can fill gaps. To the extent there are gaps, courts can kind of point that out. But a lot of what it can do is make sure that system of environmental regulation is actually being applied in a way that isn't discriminatory or unfair, or otherwise violates specific people's specific rights. And again, I think the more specific you can get to show what kinds of cases you're focusing on, to show what kinds of gaps you want this to cover, the more you can at least sharpen the debate and force people who are opposing you to say why they don't think those cases should be covered. And if they really think the legislature is so good at it, why hasn't the legislature addressed those issues already? And if they have suggestions for how the legislature should do it, great, let's do that. A lot of what a constitutional right in different jurisdictions around the world has done is often lead to further legislation or regulatory action. It's not all just directed at the courts. I've been to many countries in the world when I was a special rapporteur, where I would talk with environmental or other technical agencies, and they would refer to the fact that they had a constitutionally protected right as part of their motivation for trying to make sure that they did have an effective environmental program or effective environmental regulations. So, to some degree, on that first issue especially, I think you kind of have to ask, do you trust your courts in general? Are there other, there's a lot of open-ended language already, I have no doubt, in the Maryland Constitution. Are the courts now using that language to kind of run everything? If so, you have a bigger problem than just this right, but I doubt that that's the case. And similarly, on the frivolous lawsuits, sure. People bring all kinds of suits for all kinds of things. Courts are not unfamiliar with how to deal with frivolous litigation. The idea that this would be the straw that breaks the camel's back, and this would be the one right that they have no idea how to deal with the cases, I just think it's not, again, it's just not borne out by the experience that other states have had, other judicial systems have had with this right.
Right. Yeah, and as we've tried to argue, you can only get so many motions for summary judgment, granted before you're going to run out of plaintiffs' lawyers who want to take on these cases and spend billable time that maybe they're not actually getting compensated for, or to find litigants willing to put up, thousands of dollars for doomed claims. But on the other point, I think it's not so much, skepticism of the judiciary branch so much as it is sort of an inflated sense of self. Which is that I think in Maryland, we're kind of a victim of our own perceived success, which is that the legislature's view is we've done an amazing job on the environment, especially compared to some of our peers like Pennsylvania. And so for us to point, it makes it a tricky legislative maneuvering for us, because we were trying to point to Pennsylvania as a state with one of these rights, yet at the same time on basically every measure, including, for example, the Chesapeake Bay, we run circles around Pennsylvania, just based on the sort of ideological makeup of our legislature versus them. And so that's created a little bit of attention for us.
I can say I have read countless numbers of cases from within the United States, many other countries in the world. I have virtually never seen a court get involved in a situation where the environment was being protected. Like there's just no, there just isn't case law like that.
Yeah.
It only comes up when there's some big problem.
Right.
And on the substantive standards, courts are very reluctant to get involved in kind of telling the state or whatever the jurisdiction is, hey, you know what, you've set the standard for, I don't know, air pollution at 0.08 parts per million. It really should be 0.07 parts per million.
Right.
There just aren't decisions like that. When they get involved, it's because they're saying, you've destroyed this, you know, the ability of this community to be able to function essentially, or you've denied the community the right to even participate in the decision-making process. In other words, they focused on clear cases in which the community was either shut out completely of the ability to kind of have its rights respected, or at the end of the day, the community was severely mistreated in some way. And you might say, and you know, another argument I hear sometimes is, well, we already have laws that would cover that. Opponents to this often kind of say things almost in the same breath. On the one hand, this is going to cause huge problems. It's going to disrupt everything. On the other, it's going to have no effect whatsoever. So what's the point? And it's kind of like, well, don't you at least have to choose a lane? I don't know.
We've definitely heard those arguments out of both sides of that. And of course, you know, that's the points you make about sort of how judiciaries across the country have viewed similar issues is self-evident to me, not because I practice in these areas like you do, and certainly not because I teach young minds like you do, but just because I went to law school for 3 years. And so I think, you know, one issue that we run into, and I think that Nina sort of obliquely referenced it, is that this bill continues to go to the Environment Committee, which obviously makes sense. But the problem is that I am one of the only lawyers on the committee. And so when I'm trying to make these arguments about how judges, how the branches interact and how, you know, the judiciary is generally just going to defer to sort of legislative intent, we're really just using this as a backstop against really egregious violations rather than allowing judges to micromanage us. It kind of falls on deaf ears just because I think there's a lack of understanding. And so we've talked in the past about trying to get this redirected to the Judiciary Committee, which rather than being, you know, 5% lawyers is 95% lawyers. So anyway, these are sort of the, you know, issues that we have to, you know, we have to weigh here. But with that, you know, with the last few remaining minutes, I want to make sure that we have time for questions from everyone else. And I see Nina has unmuted. So does that sound good to you?
That sounds perfect. So if you do have questions, please begin to type them in the chat. I know I still have several. So Delegate Stewart, that was fabulous. Thank you so much, Professor Knox. Wonderful having you here. And it is oddly reassuring that it took so long for the United Nations to get to where it is. When I was listening to actually a Georgia United States state of Georgia webinar on their nascent efforts to create an environmental human rights amendment just this past year. And they anticipate that it's going to take them 20 years, you know, to get this done. So, which is all to say, we should not be distressed by that. We should be, in fact, oddly comforted by that sometimes the very best things in the world, the things that change societies in fundamental ways, take time. And it takes pioneers and people with perseverance to make sure that this happens. And that's us and all of you on the call and all of you who are going to be seeing this recording. And we thank you so much for sticking with the fight, because it is a fight worth fighting and worth winning. And so with your help and Delegate Stewart's help and Professor Knox's wisdom and people like that, we will persevere, because we have this right. We're not fighting for this right. Remember, we're fighting for the legality, right? The legal implementation of this right. So we should never have to cede a right that we have because we just can't win it, you know, in the legislature. So I want to just ask something actually, Delegate Stewart, I just saw that, I think it was just a couple of years ago, though, that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania sued Monsanto for PCBs that it was responsible for putting in. And they, in fact, the state won the right to sue Monsanto based on standing that was given to them by the Environmental Rights Amendment of Pennsylvania. So I haven't finished reading the whole case, and I don't know exactly how much they won in that, but they did win the right. So the state won the right to intercede because Monsanto was in fact polluting not just public lands, but also private lands that affected, their citizens and their residents there. So I guess for both of you, often we are positioning the amendment as against the government, right? The amendment holds government responsible. The amendment says that the government is the trustee and they're responsible for protecting the environment on behalf of all of us. And so therefore citizens, residents can use the amendment to hold government responsible. But can you help flip the narrative as well? How can the amendment in fact help government as it did in Commonwealth versus Monsanto, right? Ways that it can help the government pursue what it wants to pursue. And Professor Knox, you had to be able to make those arguments, I would imagine, because it's the governments themselves that voted this as a fundamental right, knowing that they are the ones who are primarily going to be responsible for implementing this right. How do we articulate it so that this is in fact a benefit to the government and not simply a threat to the government?
Well, so before I moved to North Carolina and began teaching at Wake Forest, I taught at Penn State for 8 years, and I'm a big fan of Pennsylvania's constitutional environmental right provision, and I just pulled it up in front of me while you were talking, so I'd make sure I got the language right. It says not only that the people have the right to clean air, pure water, and the preservation of several listed values of the environment, but it also goes on to say Pennsylvania's public natural resources are the common property of all the people, including generations yet to come. And as trustee of these resources, the Commonwealth shall conserve and maintain them for the benefit of all the people. So it's this language specifying that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is a trustee for the people of Pennsylvania with respect to these resources that the court in the Monsanto case relied on, basically to say, yes, the government has the right to act to protect these shared resources. So I do think that's worth considering in your own, as you go forward. That is to essentially codify this kind of public trust doctrine, is called, and making clear that not only do people have the right, individually, but also the state has a duty collectively. The state has a duty to essentially act to try and protect these resources for the people. And then, as you say, the state can use that in appropriate cases. It doesn't have to rely on private action. And it might make some people more comfortable with the idea that this right is, let's say, will develop within foreseeable bounds, to say that it's a right that not only is given to the people, but also the people through their representatives, through their government, can act to protect it.
Right. Are you familiar with the case? Because I know the state was not just suing to stop the PCB pollution, but suing also to recoup costs that the state was incurring because of the pollution. And I think that also could be something that could be attractive to the government. If they knew that they could use this in part to also recoup some of the costs that they have in fixing problems that private industry caused.
I don't remember exactly what remedies they got. So I can't answer that question right now. I'm sorry. I just don't remember exactly what they received. Or I mean, I think it may still be going on if I'm remembering correctly. I feel like there was just a decision last December, so it may still be active. But I don't want to. I'm just kind of speculating now. I just don't remember exactly where it stands.
Okay. I will find out, because we want to be able to come and Delegate Stewart, this is like a new narrative that we want to be able to put forward, is why this is beneficial for the government, not just, not just something the government should be fearful of.
Absolutely.
Professor Knox, you came back from the European Council just now. Was there any discussion about the Environmental Rights Amendment there?
Yeah, I did. I mean, last week I was in Strasbourg, France, meeting with governments there that are considering whether to add the right to a healthy environment to the European Convention on Human Rights. The European Convention is a treaty. It's a binding treaty that protects basic human rights, and it includes almost all the countries in Europe, not just the European Union countries, but I think that's 46 members. And it creates a court, the European Court of Human Rights. It's quite powerful in the sense that it essentially can hear appeals from the highest courts of the courts throughout Europe if the allegation is that those courts have failed to adequately protect whatever the right might be in question. And so deciding whether to add a right to a healthy environment would be a big step for them, because again, it wouldn't be simply symbolic, it would lead to further litigation. And so we discussed what that would mean in the European context. And again, one of the points we tried to make is you already have a lot of environmental protection in Europe, including a lot of rights-based environmental protection. So this right would operate, again, as a kind of a gap filler, but it wouldn't, it's not as if you would be going from 0 to 100 miles an hour all of a sudden. You know, you would be strengthening a system that you already largely have in place. I expect that it will take them quite a while to decide this. International negotiations move slowly, as you've already remarked, but maybe in 4 or 5 years, we might see that actually adopted and implemented, but they're going to decide hopefully by the end of next year whether to move forward with it, whether to recommend negotiation of an amendment to the convention. So as perhaps as early as 24, but it'll probably be more like 25 or even 26 before it gets finalized.
Sadly, well, we're running out of time. We still have to be patient. So we have to talk about contradictions. The earth is running out of time, and yet politics can only move at the speed of politics. So we have to be.
Well, there's a great quote from John Kennedy where he referred to this story of a French marshal who supposedly asked his gardener to plant a tree in the garden of the French marshal, and the gardener said the tree was, you know, a particularly slow growing species and it wouldn't reach maturity for 100 years. And at least as told by Kennedy, he said, well, in that case, the marshal said, in that case, there's no time to lose, plant it this afternoon. And that's how I feel often about the strive to protect human rights. Yes, it's a really, really long struggle. In the environmental context, especially, it's a long struggle. So that means we really got to get to work.
Amen. That sounds wonderful. Well, thank you both so very much. Delegate Stewart, we are thrilled that you are here. We wish you well in the general election. We are certainly looking forward to working with you in the upcoming session. Professor Knox, it's just a delight to meet you. I can't thank you enough for giving all that time that you gave to being the special rapporteur and giving of your time to be with us. It is really quite reassuring. And I think the one takeaway that I would like to leave with everyone is, and I hope that you don't mind that I'm sort of being very honest with all of you. I think we were playing defensive ball the past few years. I think Delegate Stewart was right. We kept responding to these challenges by the opposition, and I think that the opposition held the narrative of the amendment more powerfully than we did. And I think what we're hearing with the United Nations advance, with what Delegate Stewart was saying, with the promotion of the EJ issues, with coming up with some of the, as John was saying, the critical concerns that we have in our state, we have to come out this year on the offensive. We have to be the ones who establish the narrative and turn it to the opposition and say, why would you vote against this? Because there's also one thing that all members of the opposition have said. All members of the opposition have said, well, we really like the idea in principle. It's just, you know, in the practice. Well, if you really like the idea in principle, then you got to tell me why you're voting against it, right? And so if we can flip the narrative, come out on the offensive over the next 2 years, hopefully we will have a much, with a new, by the way, administration that we're hoping goes in, then we will have a much better chance of getting this passed in 2024. Please continue to read the emails that Claire sends out. They're full of information. Claire Miller, our communications director. Please sign up for the ambassador training programs if you want to learn more about it. Please continue to connect us with your communities. Please continue to be engaged, because as Professor Knox says, and as Delegate Stewart is encouraging us, we've can't move away from this wonderful campaign, because we have to make sure that everybody has the legal protection to a healthy environment. That's just their right. So I thank you all.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, Delegate Stewart. Thank you, Nina.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank-
This was great.